A heavy, suffocating midnight fog swallowing Buckingham Palace was violently torn apart by an emergency executive order. It was a decree that instantly froze the royal household in complete silence. King Charles III, gripping the fountain pen with pale, trembling fingers, signed an unalterable mandate that struck directly at the heart of the Edinburgh estate. With one single stroke, Prince Edward was stripped of all internal palace management and personnel control. A royal prerogative of this magnitude means the monarch possesses the absolute constitutional authority to suspend peerage privileges and internal assignments without parliamentary consent. This was not a routine administrative shift. It was a calculated, quiet purge of a shadow rogue network that pushed the entire Windsor monarchy into a state of red alert over a national security leak. Behind the double-locked oak doors of the royal study, the ailing king stared coldly at his own biological brother, delivering an ultimatum that carried the weight of an invisible blade, telling Edward to surrender in silence or watch his reputation dissolve on the front pages of the morning newspapers. The younger prince stood completely paralyzed, the air leaving his lungs as the harsh reality of his downfall set in. This systemic execution of authority did more than just neutralize the Edinburgh household. By elevating Princess Anne to command the inner palace security, the Crown rewrote the boundaries of power, erecting an absolute shield around the throne. The public now stands deeply divided over this breathless scandal. If you believe this is an authoritarian, heartless betrayal by King Charles III against his own blood, comment number 1. But if you see this as a necessary, masterfully executed strike to save the crown, comment number 2 right now. The blinding flashes of the media cameras were completely blocked behind the heavy iron gates of the palace estate. Every single lens belonging to the desperate journalists outside grew blurry, obscured by the dense London fog and a strict immediate D notice issued by the Home Office. This specific government order meant that all local and international press outlets were legally prohibited from broadcasting or publishing any details regarding the unfolding crisis, ensuring total secrecy. Outside the gate, police officers pushed back the crowds of reporters, while inside, the long gravel pathways of the palace remained dead silent. Not a single car was allowed to enter or leave the grounds, cutting off the entire royal estate from the rest of the world. The grand windows of the building were dark, showing no signs of life to the public waiting outside in the cold night. Inside the sovereign walls, the massive oak door of the private study was double-bolted from the within, sealing the occupants inside a silent tomb. Military-grade signal jammers had been activated at maximum capacity, transforming the historic room into a digital black box completely severed from the internet and all global positioning satellites. Every mobile device lay dead upon the side tables, their screens dark and useless, making it impossible for any unauthorized distress signal to escape. Under British security protocols, a total communication blackout like this is only used during extreme emergencies involving national security or threats to the crown. The thick walls of the room absorbed all sounds from the outside, creating an isolated space where only the ticking of an old grandfather clock could be heard. The air felt heavy, almost hard to breathe, as the jammers hummed quietly in the background, erasing any connection to modern technology. King Charles III sat perfectly motionless upon his worn leather armchair, his thin frame looking frail against the heavy fabric of his tailored suit. His breathing sounded shallow and labored, a physical consequence of the continuous chemotherapy sessions that had drained his body but left his mind entirely untouched. Despite his hollow cheeks and pale skin, the king possessed a sharp, unyielding alertness, his eyes cutting through the dimly lit room with a freezing gaze that demanded absolute submission. His hands rested flat on the armrests, his fingers perfectly still, showing no sign of weakness or hesitation despite his medical state. He did not look at the papers on his desk, keeping his eyes locked onto the target in front of him. Every small breath he took seemed to echo in the quiet room, a reminder of his fragile health, but also of his absolute power as the ruling monarch. Across the room, Princess Anne stood perfectly straight, like a stone monument in the corner, her presence radiating an undeniable authority. She wore her full ceremonial general military uniform, every medal reflecting the low golden light of the lamps, while her white-gloved hands were locked tightly behind her back. Not a single emotion registered on her face as she looked directly ahead, a silent, cold witness prepared to oversee the systematic downfall of her own younger brother. Her uniform was flawless, with every button and strap in its exact place, showing her lifelong commitment to royal discipline. She did not move a single muscle, standing so still that she barely seemed to breathe at all. Her role in this room was clear, acting as the ultimate protector of the family name and the chief enforcer of the king's final orders. Right at the exact center of the floor, Prince Edward stood exposed, his hands tightly clasped together in a desperate attempt to conceal the visible shaking of his fingers. Cold sweat began to bead along his forehead despite the low temperature of the room, which had been chilled by the oppressive silence of the royal aides standing frozen against the walls. Those personal secretaries and guards remained completely motionless, their eyes fixed ahead, acting as a human barrier that sealed the prince within his own nightmare. Edward could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, a fast and panicked rhythm that contrasted with the slow ticking of the clock. He shifted his weight slightly from one foot to the other, but the cold look from his brother instantly forced him to freeze again. His throat felt completely dry, and he swallowed hard, trying to find a way to break the suffocating silence that filled the space around him. The royal aides lined up against the dark wood panels of the walls were chosen for their absolute discretion and loyalty to the king. In royal tradition, these officials are bound by strict oaths of secrecy, meaning that anything seen or heard within these private walls can never be spoken of to outsiders under penalty of law. They stood with their heads held up, staring straight into the empty space of the room, completely ignoring the visible panic of the prince standing just a few feet away from them. Their presence added to the feeling of a formal trial, making it clear to Edward that he was not surrounded by family, but by the official machinery of the state. No one offered him a chair, leaving him to stand alone under the sharp golden light of the central chandelier. As the minutes dragged on, the cold air in the study seemed to grow even heavier, pressing down on the isolated prince. The faint smell of old paper and leather filled the room, mixing with the sterile scent of the medical treatments the king had received earlier that day. Charles III made no movement to speak, using the silence as a psychological weapon to break his brother's resolve before the actual confrontation even started. Edward's eyes locked onto the floorboards beneath him, noticing how the shadow of his sister stretched across the rug, slowly reaching his own shoes. It was a visual reminder that he was completely trapped, with no allies left in the room and no way to escape the judgment that was about to fall upon him. Prince Edward fell into a state of extreme paranoia regarding the slimmed-down monarchy plan started by his older brother. He realized with growing fear that the entire Edinburgh branch of the family was being slowly pushed to the edges of history, losing both their official budget and their ancient privileges. As he watched younger royals take the spotlight, Edward felt a deep sense of panic about his future. The official royal funds were shrinking, and his name was being left off important guest lists for state events. He spent long hours alone in his private rooms, looking over old family records and realizing how fast his influence was slipping away. It became clear to him that if he did not act immediately, his family would become completely irrelevant within the palace walls. This fear grew much worse whenever he thought about what would happen after King Charles III passed away. Edward was terrified that Prince William would cut away his remaining influence entirely once he took the throne. To protect himself, Edward secretly reached out to retired security officers and former royal secret agents to build an independent information network. He began hosting private dinners at his country estate, inviting men who used to run the palace protection squads. These were people who still had keys to old files and knew how to watch the movements of the senior royals. Edward wanted his own private intelligence team, a group that answered only to him and could feed him secrets before anyone else knew them. Under the Royal Security Act of 2011, any act of contacting, hiring, or building shadow communication channels with armed forces personnel without written approval from the Cabinet Office is strictly classified as an abuse of power and a threat to national security. This law was created to make sure that only the reigning monarch and the official government could control security teams. By trying to build his own ring of informants, Edward was breaking a major constitutional rule. He thought he was just protecting his family, but on paper, he was creating a rogue spy network inside the kingdom. His actions bypassed the official chief of police and the Home Secretary, which made his private project look like an underground rebellion against the state. Edward truly believed that the king, constantly canceling public events to receive medical treatments over the past year, created the perfect power vacuum. He saw his brother's weakness as his best chance to finish his political defense system so he could negotiate with the next generation of rulers. While the king was away in London hospitals, Edward was busy sending encrypted messages and meeting his new operatives in quiet corners of royal parks. He felt powerful for the first time in years, believing that when William eventually became king, Edward would hold enough secrets to force the new monarch to keep the Edinburgh budget intact. He thought he was playing a smart game of chess, using the king's illness to secure his own survival. However, his massive self-satisfaction made Edward blind to a simple truth. In the world of secret agents, loyalty always belongs to the person currently wearing the crown. Every single one of his secret reports had already been decoded and placed directly onto the king's desk before the files could even leave the borders of London. The retired officers Edward trusted were actually still loyal to the reigning monarch and reported the unusual contacts immediately. The technology Edward used to hide his messages was easily cracked by the palace's official cybersecurity team. While Edward thought he was successfully building an empire in the dark, every single move he made was being watched, recorded, and printed out for his older brother to read. The paranoia had completely twisted Edward's judgment over the months. He began to see enemies in every corridor, which only made him lean harder into his illegal network. He did not realize that the very people he was hiring were sending duplicates of his files straight to Princess Anne's office. Anne had been tracking the unusual financial movements from the Edinburgh accounts for weeks, watching the money flow toward these retired security operatives. Every time Edward met an informant at a quiet pub or sent an unsigned letter, a digital footprint was logged. The net was closing in on him, but he was too consumed by his own fear of becoming nobody to notice the trap being laid at his feet. During this time, the king's private secretaries were quietly gathering the evidence into a thick leather binder. They documented every single breach of the 2011 Security Act, creating an undeniable case against the prince. The king read these reports during his quiet hours between hospital visits, feeling a deep sadness, but also a growing anger at his brother's betrayal. Charles could not understand how Edward could prioritize his own budget and status while the family was facing such a difficult health crisis. The king realized that this was not just a small family argument, but a real danger to the stability of the crown that had to be crushed completely. Edward's absolute confidence in his plan was his biggest mistake. He genuinely believed he was invisible, thinking the palace staff was too busy dealing with the king's cancer treatments to notice his activities. He started giving bolder orders to his informants, even asking for schedules of Prince William's private meetings. This crossed a major red line for the inner palace security. The moment Edward tried to peer into the future king's daily movements, the official intelligence service stepped in. They did not arrest him immediately, choosing instead to let him gather more evidence against himself, waiting for the perfect moment to catch him completely unprepared. By the time the winter fog rolled into London, the trap was fully set. Edward had compiled what he thought was a powerful dossier of inside information, completely unaware that the original copies of those exact documents were sitting in a secure safe inside the king's private study. He walked into Buckingham Palace that fateful night, thinking he was a powerful player who could dictate his own terms to the family. He had no idea that his shadow network had already been completely deactivated from the inside out, leaving him standing entirely alone in front of his angry sovereign. The scene unfolded in the absolute secrecy of the king's private study inside Buckingham Palace. King Charles III did not say a single word. He used his thin, frail finger to push a small metallic object across the smooth, polished surface of the mahogany desk. The heavy item slid slowly, making a sharp, cold scraping sound against the wood before coming to a sudden stop right in front of Prince Edward. It was a solid bronze identification badge belonging directly to the royal guards. Under the strict protocols of the British monarchy, a royal security pass is the highest form of security clearance in existence. This specific token allows its holder to pass through every single restricted boundary surrounding the head of state without ever undergoing a physical search or questioning by security personnel. The undeniable evidence of Edward's abuse of power became absolute when the intelligence services discovered this exact bronze pass tucked inside a leaked diplomatic briefcase belonging to a foreign billionaire. It was clear proof that the prince had compromised the inner sanctum of the family. The king made a slow, silent gesture with his hand, signaling for all the personal assistants, secretaries, and guards to immediately leave the room. The heavy oak door clicked shut as the senior aide locked the bolt from the outside for a second time, trapping the two brothers together. This action forced Edward into a suffocating, one-on-one confrontation under the dim, low light of the desk lamp. The massive room felt smaller, colder, and completely cut off from the rest of the world. The king spoke with a quiet but devastating voice that cut straight through Edward's desperate attempts to explain himself. Every time the prince tried to use words like family loyalty or preparing for the future of the estate, the monarch cut him off with sharp, short sentences that landed like a physical blow. Charles made it completely clear that the crown would never tolerate a tiny, rogue state operating inside the walls of the palace itself. The sovereign's indirect words stripped away every layer of Edward's defense, exposing his actions as nothing less than a betrayal of the throne. Edward stood completely frozen in place, staring down at the polished bronze pass as it reflected the yellow light from above. His entire political defense system, which he had spent an entire year secretly building, dissolved into nothingness in a matter of seconds. He looked at his older brother and finally realized the terrifying truth. He had pushed past the absolute limit of a ruling monarch who was currently fighting a life-and-death battle against cancer, and there was no turning back. The heavy oak door of the private study swung open, the exact moment the confrontation reached its bitter end. Prince William entered the room with a measured, steady gait that betrayed no emotion. He carried a document signed with thick, red ink, a formal command that would trigger the immediate erasure of the Edinburgh office from the royal structure. He placed the paper on the mahogany desk, the seal glinting under the dim light, as a final confirmation that the decision was permanent. Edward looked at the signature and realized that his time as a power broker within the house had come to an end. Within less than 2 hours, the Royal Special Protection Teams initiated a synchronized raid across the palace grounds. This was not a chaotic event, but a calculated, clinical operation. These officers knew every secret passage and hidden office where Edward had established his illegal network. They moved through the corridors with silent efficiency, dismantling the shadow security apparatus he had built over the previous year. They seized every encrypted journal, confiscated private server drives, and removed sensitive files detailing the secret transactions he had conducted with foreign entities. Everything was processed, labeled, and hauled away in secure cases before the sun began to rise over London. The prince had built a system meant to watch the palace, but that same system had become the evidence used to dismantle his own standing. King Charles III made a strategic choice during those final minutes in the study that would dictate the future of the monarchy. He could have handed this massive authority directly to Prince William, the heir to the throne. However, he understood the optics of such a move. If the young heir had stepped into the role of the chief enforcer, the media would have immediately spun the narrative into a story about a young prince seizing power before his time. It would have created a storm of speculation and controversy that the family did not need. The king wanted a clean transition that avoided any hint of a coup from the younger generation. Instead, the monarch placed his absolute trust in Princess Anne. She was the only person left in the family who held the unbreakable, absolute loyalty of the old palace guard. Her reputation was forged in decades of steady service, and she had remained entirely outside the influence of the shadow network that Edward had tried to construct. Because she was not seeking the throne, her involvement would not be viewed as an attempt to gain personal political standing. She was the perfect choice to ensure a clean, undeniable reset of the palace internal structure. Her presence provided the stability the crown required to survive the scandal without inviting public scrutiny into the heir apparent. A formal constitutional decree was drafted and enacted before the morning newspapers could even be printed. This document officially established a new and powerful position for the Princess Royal. She was named the Chief of Palace Security and Personnel, a title that came with the ultimate authority over the household. The order granted her the power of life and death over all staff members, meaning she held the final say on who could be approved, investigated, or dismissed from the grounds of the palace from that moment forward. The weight of this new mandate was heavy. Princess Anne now possessed the legal capacity to audit every single employee, from the high-ranking diplomats to the maintenance crew. She became the ultimate filter for the entire household. Any individual who wanted to step past the gates of the palace now had to pass through her direct supervision. This change ensured that no unauthorized shadow network could ever emerge again, as she was tasked with rooting out any potential threats with a cold, detached efficiency. While the special teams finalized the seizure of the prince's private documents, the Princess Royal walked through the corridors of her new jurisdiction. Her presence alone acted as a warning to those who had been loyal to Edward. She was no longer just a family member attending charity events. She was now the protector of the institution, standing at the center of the household with the full backing of the crown. The era of loose security and internal political gaming had finished. The new order was defined by total control and absolute vigilance, and the palace prepared to face the dawn under the watchful eyes of a woman who had never failed the crown. As the first light of dawn touched the stained glass windows of Windsor Castle, a top-secret negotiation meeting was established. Prince William led the grim proceeding, flanked by the crown's top legal team and a defeated Prince Edward. The cold morning light did nothing to warm the room, where the future of the Edinburgh estate was about to be legally severed. Under the amended constitution, William acted with full legal authority as a Councillor of State. This specific designation meant the Prince of Wales possessed the absolute right to sign internal compromise agreements on behalf of the ailing king without requiring parliamentary confirmation. Furthermore, his financial control over the vast Duchy of Cornwall granted him an immediate, invisible blade. He could freeze every single one of Edward's shadow funding channels instantly, cutting off his brother's resources without ever needing a public vote or political debate. King Charles III purposefully stepped back behind the velvet curtain of the proceedings. This deliberate absence created a flawless layer of plausible deniability, protecting the sovereign from the dirty mechanics of the purge. This left William to play the role of the heartless judge alone. The young heir looked directly into his uncle's eyes, forcing Edward to face a brutal reality, making it clear that William's future reign would completely erase the Edinburgh line from royal history if he refused to cooperate. There was no room for family sentiment. It was a cold calculation of survival. Edward stood completely broken, realizing his defense was entirely gone. He accepted the terms, placing his signature onto a binding pledge that labeled his exit as a voluntary retirement due to family reasons. This document stripped him of his status, transferring all of his former royal patronages directly to the office of Princess Anne. In return for this total surrender, the palace promised absolute silence, guaranteeing that the true nature of his security breach would never reach the media. This bitter settlement was finalized with clinical precision before the first morning newspaper in London could even go to print. The machinery of the state worked perfectly in the dark, preserving a completely smooth surface for the public. By handling the destruction of Edward's career through William's hand, the Crown kept Princess Anne completely clean of the political blood, ensuring her hands were untainted as she officially took command of the palace gates. The entire shadow security purge in the freezing London night closed with a cold legal settlement, stripping the Edinburgh estate of all internal palace management, but opening a powerful new chapter for Princess Anne as Chief of Palace Security and Personnel. The crisis began with Prince Edward's deep fear of being pushed to the margins, led to a fatal mistake when he leaked the highly classified bronze security token, and ended with a heartless legal compromise engineered by Prince William at dawn to protect the purity of the Windsor dynasty. As the dark car carrying Edward quietly departed the Windsor Castle grounds into the morning mist, his symbolic bronze pass was officially tossed into a high-security incinerator, turning his personal ambitions into ash. King Charles III stood entirely alone behind a high window curtain, his exhausted eyes watching the darkness slowly fade away. The king successfully preserved the absolute dignity of the throne, but the price was a permanent, unhealable fracture in the bond of brotherhood. The authority of the crown is a brilliant but merciless flame, willing to crush the closest blood ties to guarantee the survival of an institution, leaving a profound question for future generations about the line between duty and family. Did this decisive purge by King Charles III reveal the wisdom of a great ruler or the tragedy of an authoritarian family dynasty? Comment number 1 if you see a wise leader, or comment number 2 if you see a heartless tragedy, and hit the notification bell to stay with us as we continue to decode the next hidden secrets of royal power.